Hello, Mr. Threadgold. Today, I'm going to be talking about the different types of joints in the human skeleton. I'm sorry I could not perform this live, but the technical issues did not make it possible. Let's get started. A joint is a junction between two or more bones or cartilages. It is a device to permit movement in a hard or rigid skeleton. The joints keep movement and stability and strength, where some joints sacrifice movement for strength, and other joints sacrifice strength for movement. There are three types of joints: fibrous joints, cartilaginous joints, and synovial joints, where each provides different parts of the body to join in different ways. We describe the movement of a joint with the following terms. Uni, bi, and multi-axial movement are using different axes of rotation. Flexion and extension describes the bending and straightening. Adduction and abduction is the movement towards and away from the midline of the body, and rotation is where the bones move around on a longitudinal axis. Firstly, by looking at this diagram of a typical synovial joint, you can see the different parts of the joint labelled. Each part of the joint has a significant part to play in the movement and stability of the joint. Firstly, you can see the muscle connecting to the bone or epiphysis, which is where the muscle attaches to the bone, which is called a tendon. You can also see the ligament, which connects the two epiphyses together. The articular cartilage is there as a padding between the connection of the bones and helps flexibility and stabilization in the joint. The synovial cavity is a fluid in between the bones which acts as a lubricant to minimize friction and make the joint more flexible. The bursa does a similar job, yet it is a sac that reduces friction by sitting where the bones will rub. The joint capsule holds the bones and fluids in place to help stabilize the joint, while still allowing free movement. Now that we've gone through this and looked at the structures of a basic joint, I will be talking about three different types of joints. Firstly is the fibrous joint. In these types of joints, the bones are fused together or joined by a mean of fibrous tissue, which means that they are either immovable or permit movement to a very limited extent. Fibrous joints can further be divided into three subtypes. The first of which are sutures, which are particular to the skull and are immovable. There are 5 different types of sutures that interlock the bones to prevent any movement. These are as shown: plain sutures, serrate sutures, denticular sutures, squamous sutures, limbose sutures, and syngilosis. The second subtype of fibrous joint is the syndesmosis. In this joint, the bone is connected with intergrossus ligament, which relates to the tibiofibrillar joint, where there are 2 separate long bones joining at either end. These ligaments, attached to the bone, create stability and strength in the joint. This diagram shows where each of the ligaments are located. The last subtype is the gemophosis, also known as the peg and socket joints. These joints relate mainly to the tooth in the socket, which is illustrated in the diagram, labelling the skull and mouth area. The next type of joint are the cartilaginous joints. These are the joints that have cartilage between the bones, holding them together. This means that there is slight movement in the joint. There are 2 subtypes of cartilaginous joints, which are primary cartilaginous joints, or synchondrosis, where the bones are united by a layer of hyaline cartilage. This piece of cartilage sits in between long bones and expands into the bone, causing growth. After a certain age, this cartilage is replaced by bone, and this is when you've known you've stopped growing. The diagram shows where the cartilages sit in the long bone. The other subtype is secondary cartilaginous joint, or symphysis, also known as the fibrocartilaginous joints. Their articular surface is covered by a thin layer of hyaline cartilage, and the bones are united by fibrocartilage, and is permanent throughout your life. An example of this is your vertebral column, shown in the diagram. The last type of joint is the synovial joint. This is the most common joint as it provides the most movement in the body. There are 5 types of synovial joints, as shown. Firstly is the hinge joint, where the joints in the articular surface are pulley-shaped, as seen in the diagram showing an elbow joint. There are strong collateral ligaments in the joint to provide stability, and movements are permitted in one plane around the axis. Secondly is the pivot joint. These are formed by a central bony pivot surrounded by an osteoligamentous ring. Movements can only go from side to side horizontally on a vertical axis. An example of this is the craniovertebral joint, connecting the skull to the spinal cord. Thirdly is the ellipsoid joint. This is where an oval convex male surface is fitting into an ellipsoid female surface. This means that there is two movement on one axis: flexion and extensions around the transverse axis, and adduction and abduction around the anteroposterior axis. Ellipsoid joints are very well shown with the phalanges in the hand. Fourthly, we have a saddle joint, which is similar to an ellipsoid joint, yet with rotation around a third axis, but this occurs independently. This is mainly shown just in your thumb, as it is more flexible than your phalanges. Last of the synovial joints, we have the ball and socket joint, or sporoidal joints. These articular surface include a globe-shaped head proximal of a long bone fitting into a socket. Movement is extremely flexible with an infinite number of axes, with all types of movement occurring freely. This joint is shown in the hip joint as seen on screen. This concludes my presentation. Thank you for watching my presentation on joints. I hope my lecture was helpful and interesting.